From the mid-1980s to the late 1990s, my grandfather worked at NASA. Despite constant pestering from my brother and I, he never really talked about his time at NASA, always claiming that it just wasn't as glamorous as everyone always played it up to be. If I remember correctly, he was involved with the picture-video aspect of the Galileo space probe. He helped design the cameras and was actually on the committee that saw the surface of some of Jupiter's moons before any other humans. He always spoke somewhat guardedly when we asked him about what his job used to be like. Grandma claimed it was due to an old habit developed from being subject to NASA's non-disclosure agreement for the better part of 30 years. Imagine my surprise when I found some old NASA folders and an old NASA film reel in a dusty filing cabinet tucked away in my grandparents' attic. The film reel read, "Galileo Camera Crew Summer Picnic, 1990. Upon opening the folders, I found pages and pages of my grandfather's squiggly handwritten notes describing the first images from the Galileo probe. Also, imagine my further surprise when I found, tucked within the loose-leaf pages of the Galileo mission, an even older selection of handwritten notes depicting the voyage of something called Sagan 5. The following is what I was able to decipher from his chicken scratch. Enjoy. Start transcription. Date: October 18, 1989. Successful release of both Galileo and Sagan 5 into Earth's orbit. In Galileo they head outward towards Ganymede and the other Galilean moons. Sagan 5 onward to Venus and Mercury. The primary mission is to land, if possible, on the surface of Venus and take physical samples of crust and atmosphere. Sagan 5 to add samples and date to the data tables taken by the Russian Venera. If probe is still serviceable, it will too then return to Earth, offload samples taken, get cleaned and modified for a Mercury landing. Then we release it as Sagan 6 with the next satellite launch, and do the whole thing again with Mercury. However, it will take a little over 3 months to reach Venus. More updates to follow. Date: October 21, 1989. There was a successful test of all the cameras. Thankfully, all cameras are functioning as intended. We took several pictures of Earth and a few of Venus, Mercury, and Mars as well. There is some difficulty moving the main rear camera, but it was still serviceable. It's possible it got jostled on takeoff. Date: January 26, 1990. Sagan 5 arrival at Venus. Some maneuvering was accomplished to get it into a stable orbit by the piloting team. They had to take over our video feeds yet again. Once that was done, we took several pictures. Venus is really very beautiful. Sagan 5 is prepared to settle into long-term orbit and orient itself to take atmospheric readings and surface images if possible for the next month before descending into the surface of Venus. I know surface images are unlikely before landing due to the atmosphere and stuff, but we can hope. Date: January 31, 1990. When adjusting camera 4, the main rear-facing camera that wasn't functioning properly, it was decided to take more pictures of Earth from Venus's orbit. The camera operator, not me, but Jerry this time, got disoriented and accidentally swung the camera in the opposite direction. The next part of the entry was more difficult to decipher as it appeared to be written hastily, but I have written it here as close to verbatim as I could. Huge discovery. While adjusting the cameras, a previously unknown planet was sighted in the inner solar system. Some scratchy stuff I couldn't read. It appears to be nearly exactly opposite of Earth. Some calculations that were crossed out. It must be exactly opposite of Earth. I have to tell Henriksen. The rest of this passage fades out, and the new few pages and dates were filled with calculations, vectors, and musings that my non-NASA trained mind could not follow and would be way too tedious to display in this document. If anyone really wants these calculations, I can scan them and email them to you, but they're mostly unintelligible scribblings to me. Date: February 19, 1990. Good news. The higher-ups have decided that the landing of Sagan 5 on Venus will be abandoned. NASA has determined, and we all agree, that the single use of Sagan 5's landing equipment would be put to better use on this new planet. We have been temporarily calling this planet Somnus after the Roman god of sleep. You know, it was actually my idea. It seemed fitting. Hopefully it sticks. Due to its still relatively close apparent proximity to the Sun, accurate readings of its size and composition are still too sophisticated for Sagan 5 instruments to pick up. We will have to wait. A plan is being devised by the piloting team to visit this new planet. It sounds like Sagan 5 will orbit Venus for the next 9.5 months, and then make the jump to Somnus when their orbits are closest. The probe will then proceed to orbit, land, and take samples, as was initially planned on Venus. Once samples are taken, Sagan 5 will return to orbit and make the trip in reverse. First to Venus, and then to Earth when the orbits are favorable. Fuel will be tight, but NASA always plans for contingencies. So I think we'll be okay. Date: February 24, October 25, 1990. The following months have all been grouped together because they're all very similar. Hundreds of pictures were taken, calculations were run, speculations were tossed about, and everyone at NASA was ablaze with excitement. I can say, with some small amount of humor, that the writing in these months was by far the cleanest and most orderly writing of the entire manuscript. It seems that my grandfather could keep fantastic notes when he wanted to, many of which are calculations that I don't have the first clue how to understand. But I can confidently show the conclusions that NASA came to about this planet over the nearly 10 months they studied before arriving. The most interesting ones, or at least the ones I understand enough to list, I've included below along with my best interpretation of the notes and/or what I believe to be their significance. Radius: 3,840.7 miles, or 6,181 kilometers. This makes Somnus less than 3% smaller than Earth. Mass: 5.98 times 10 to the 24th kilograms. This mass is slightly more than the mass of Earth, roughly 0.1% more. Since it has a smaller volume but larger mass, Somnus has a higher density than Earth. This higher density is estimated to stem from a larger metallic core, which would possibly result in a more powerful magnetic field than Earth. Atmosphere: habitable. The primary compound of Somnus' atmosphere is composed primarily of nitrogen 78% and oxygen 23%. The remaining 1% is comprised of a few other gaseous elements. Due to its slightly higher mass and stronger magnetic field, Somnus has higher concentrations of hydrogen and helium. Surface: Somnus is filled with almost equal volumes with verdant green land and bluish-green oceans. Its rotational axis is nearly perpendicular to its orbit at 85.2%. Due to its extreme rotational axis, there are no permanent ice caps. Due to its substantial atmosphere, there are relatively few surface craters and blemishes on Somnus' surface. The only blemishes are many large canyons that cover its surface like cracks in a window. My grandfather was most interested in this aspect of the new planet. There were even a couple rudimentary sketches of the mystery planet in the margin of a couple sheets. Unfortunately, my grandfather, despite being an excellent photographer, was lousy at pencil art, and the sketches just looked like a shaky, poorly shaded version of Earth. Rotation: Somnus rotates at a speed notably faster than that of Earth, making a full rotation in about 18 Earth hours. Most of these qualities seem to be written down as if copied from somewhere else. The camera crew was most likely privy to the NASA engineers group meetings and must have copied down the facts that seem most interesting to them. Date: October 29, 1990. Due to the large amount of data gathered on the 9-month voyage towards Somnus and the full-to-bursting curiosity of everyone here at NASA, the timetable has been accelerated and the landing is now scheduled to be in early December in just over a month. Excitement is at a breaking point. This planet is so beautiful. I can't wait to see the surface. Date: December 3, 1990. We land tomorrow. Today, the camera feeds were taken up by the piloting engineers as they need them for calculations on how to safely land Sagan 5. Not much else to report. The visual team, piloting team, and data acquisition team are all sick with excitement. But no one but the piloting team can do anything until tomorrow. I've taken so many surface pictures. Some of the pictures from the dark side show what appear to be very faint lights. The onboard geologist and biologist are arguing amongst themselves. They can't agree if these glowing areas are either exposed lava pools or some kind of photophosphorescent plant growth. I don't know. Personally, I hope there are cities, but we haven't detected any signs of life so far. So, probably not. Oh well, it's probably for the best anyway. At the end of his notes for the day, my grandfather was apparently in the mood to wax poetic. His notes end with, "Tomorrow, we breach a new world. Land not yet seen by earthling eyes. May she be as fond of us as we are of her." Date: December 4, 1990. Landing was a success. The piloting crew managed a near-perfect landing and managed not to damage any of the cameras. There was a slight jarring during the landing that might have caused the main rear camera to lose servo control. It's currently pointing at the ground just behind the probe. It will make traveling backwards difficult, but it should be still usable for some close-up analyzation of the terrain. Spirits are still high. From this location, we can see a deep green lake and a reddish rocky outcropping that slopes gently down the shore. There are weird fern-like trees that block most of our view from here. The ground from the broken rear camera appears to be not grass-covered, but covered in some sort of light green lichen. The dirt is somewhat moist and reddish in color, similar to the rocky outcropping in front of us. The exploration is about to begin in earnest. The delay in communications is killing me. This was the end of the page. My grandfather's impatience was clearly displayed by some messy doodling off in the bottom of the right margin. Unfortunately, it is at this point that there are several pages missing from my grandfather's notes. The last and only other page I could find that was unrelated to the Galileo mission only had a few lines of very clear handwriting. It said, Date: December 8, 1990. The landing was a failure. Due to an unexpected transmission interruption from the atmosphere of Venus, the Sagan 5 probe crash-landed on the surface of Venus. All footage and data were lost. Morale is still high. The Galileo probe is still functioning properly. More updates on that voyage to follow. And transcription. Needless to say, this short, matter-of-fact dismissal was very perplexing. He had seemed so excited to see the surface of Somnus and had even confirmed on the last page that the landing was a success. I looked for hours inside the dusty old filing cabinet for any sheets that might have been lost without success. I could only hope that more answers were somehow displayed on the roll of film I found with the pages. The one marked as the summer party of 1990. It took me a little searching to come up with an old projector to play this footage on, but they are not as rare as one might think. Fortunately for my raging curiosity, the film did not depict the summer party of 1990, but something else entirely. What that something else is, I will try my best to describe with the rest of this post. Many of the things shown on the film do not make strict sense, and others may seem constructed for shock and awe. I would like to at least formally say that I have not made any of this up, nor have I exaggerated or romanticized any of the things I've seen on the tape. It would not only be a crime to claim that I could fabricate something like this, but it is also potentially very dangerous to try. Please, hear the rest of this post in all seriousness, and do not jump to any rash conclusions before finishing it. The footage appeared to be secondary footage, or perhaps some sort of redundancy footage of the Sagan Five's main central and rear camera feeds. Each of the 6 cameras had their own screen. The 4 smaller camera feeds appeared to be off to the right of the film. Where my camera was pointing was at the 2 large screens on the left that displayed the forward camera and the reverse camera. Below the forward camera, which was the lower of the 2, the camera team and the piloting team sat in folding chairs behind a desk cluttered with coffee cups, scraps of food, and loose paper. Controlling what appeared to be the main forward camera was my grandfather. He was seated, sort of centrally holding a small joystick. Directly next to him was another, older gentleman holding a much more complicated control apparatus. This, I assume, was the pilot in command. Together, they were conversing and pointing slightly at the screens. Because this was just a film roll and not a digital video, there was no sound. It appeared to me that they were planning the moves of the probe in tandem, as there is a 16+ minute delay in any corrections they might have to make. It wasn't detailed in my grandfather's notes, but it appears that the Sagan 5 probe stored within itself a small mini probe that was to be used for the physical sample collection. I do not have any way to prove this, but this small probe appeared to be built similarly to a small cart or buggy about the size of a remote control car. All of these assumptions are based off of the view that popped up in place of the broken camera 4 display and the small glimpse I received from the main probe. The camera description was Sagan Mini. The film roll jumped, and the camera crew, pilot team and position of the landscape around the Sagan Mini probe was moving. It came to me that the film was probably cut and patched over the long stretches where the communications delay that forced the NASA teams to wait around. The footage appeared to be taken from about 6 or so inches off of the ground, and 2 small dark gray wheels were just barely visible at the bottom corners of the screen. On the top screen, there was a small gray dot slowly working its way down the slight slope towards the green lake. Sagan Mini appeared to be working its way towards the water first, and, based off of the pointing and general steering going on by the piloting and camera teams, would then prepare to head up the slope towards the rocky outcropping to the left, just out of view. At the moment, however, the small probe was working its way over the small roots that stuck out of the ground, connected to the gigantic green trees that surrounded both probes. These trees were, by my best estimate, anywhere from 20 to 50 feet tall and covered in the same sort of light green lichen that coated the floor of the forest and the field beyond. Their trunks were slightly distended in the middle, like a barrel, and very wide with small depressions or folds that ran up their height perpendicular to the ground. As the trunks neared the canopy of these trees, the lichen-like growth on the trunk stopped, and the trunks split outwards into hundreds of small branches that fanned very wide and then continued upwards for another few feet. At the top of these branches, there lay what appeared to be a single massive leaf, probably nearly an inch thick and shaped similarly to a lily pad that connected to each of the small green branch supports. The entire plant, tree or fern or something else I don't know, seemed to be spongy or rubbery. They trembled and even stretched slightly in what appeared to be a gentle breeze blowing in from the lakefront down the mild slope. Even though there was no sound coming from the film other than the soft clicking of the projector, the scene seemed quiet. No movement could be seen in the giant lily pad forest, except for the gentle undulations of the lily pad trees themselves. There didn't appear to be any bugs or small creatures in the forest. No discernible tracks could be found, except for the 2 small treads created by the Sagan Mini. It was serene, but also slightly unsettling, to be watching a world and feel like you were the only thing there. Tension seemed to be rising among the engineers and scientists. They seemed to be discussing something displayed by one of the side cameras on the main Sagan 5 probe. Unfortunately for me and you, we will never know what this was, because those displays were off-screen. Regardless of the unrest, the Sagan Mini had received its orders several hours before, so it kept on its slow trek towards the emerald green water. After another 2 minutes or so of movement, the small probe must have reached the end of its pre-programmed trip, because it paused about 10 to 15 feet away from the edge of the water. The water, which did not appear to be an ocean, and instead was likely just a very large lake, probably a few miles across. Its deep green water was still, save for slight ripples caused by the soft breeze. Far away, nearly to the horizon, the Sagan Mini was able to discern more of those strange lily pad trees and something else that appeared to be gigantic grass. Even though they must have been 50 or more feet tall, these green-like grass trees waved more strongly in the breeze. Beyond the trees and giant grass, the bluish-purple sky stretched cloudless as far as the eye could see. More commands were sent to Sagan 5, and the small probe did not move again until the film was spliced for the second time. The film jumped again, and suddenly I was looking at the Emerald Lake again. But this time, the water was slightly choppier, and the previously bright blue sky with hints of purple had a more serious gray tint. I watched as the small robot drove up to the waterline and extended its small arm with a beaker on it and dipped it into the lake. Another small arm came into frame and stoppered the small beaker, and then both arms disappeared from view. Sagan Mini then, as if it was satisfied with a job well done, turned crisply to face the rocky outcropping. Sitting up on the hill, standing at the foot of a large green and grey mountain, out of view previously, was a structure. Like a proud declaration, there it stood, hundreds of feet of dark grey-black polished stone, screaming of some kind of intelligent construction. There did not appear to be any other signs of intelligent life that either probe could see. Just this one proud pillar. Frustratingly, the Sagan Mini was traveling in a path slightly off from the large pillar. Instead, it was slowly traveling towards the reddish rock formation to the right of this strange pillar. Unaware of everyone's frantic excitement and commotion of gesturing and shouting, the mini probe continued its pre-programmed path and began to analyze the dusty reddish-brown rocks. Much of the footage for the next hour or so was wild movements from the engineers and NASA scientists with the backdrop of calm rock analyzation by the small Sagan Mini probe. I would like to say that these rocks were new and strange, like the plant life, but they just look like rocks to me. After a long, and rather boring if I'm being honest, time of looking at the rocks, the crew debating on the best course of action, and more rocks, the film finally cut again to the small probe traveling up the gentle rocky slope. The sky was dark, and it was very difficult at first to discern the surrounding of the probe. Fittingly, Somnus, named for the Roman god of sleep, has no moons, and its nights are very dark. The only light came from the stars above. The Sagan Mini probe was not equipped with night vision camera, but the larger, full-sized Sagan 5 was. On the top screen, I could just barely make out the small remote mini probe against the rocks as it climbed out of view. As the small probe continued up in the darkness, the film spliced again, and I got to watch the sunrise behind the mountains. I say this in all seriousness, not just because of the location. The sunrise on Somnus was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Because of the slightly denser atmosphere, the sunrise was more spectacular than the reddish sunrise here on Earth. Behind the reddish mountains, covered in soft light green lichen and spongy lily pad trees, the alien sky was deep red. Along the border of the mountain, the sky was nearly bubblegum pink. The pink sky and the red clouds softly gave way to red, then maroon and purple before blending into the deep, deep purple-black that was the night sky. From the Sagan 5 probe, which was still oriented at the lake below, the red and purple sky was reflected in the still emerald green water of the large lake and diffused slightly through the thin mist or fog that was hovering a few feet above the lake's surface. It was mesmerizing. As the sun began to fully rise, and the deep reds and purples faded to bright bluish lavender, the Sagan Mini probe finally reached the outcropping with the massive alien obelisk. As Sagan Mini approached the massive structure, its reflection was visible in the dark grey polished stone. Inset into the polished stone, there appeared to be a small rows of dots and squiggles. The rows wrapped all the way around the obelisk and appeared to extend its top in intervals of about a foot or so. Before the dots and squiggles could be analyzed, the obelisk changed, starting from the bottom and continuing as far up as the screen would show, The surface of the obelisk cracked into tiny scales, so small they were hard to see. Then, rippling outwards, coming out from the ground below the mini-probe, these tiny scales seemed to flip around so that they were facing inside out, and then reformed into a polished surface. On the surface, which I think is now safe to assume is not stone, were different squiggles and dots. The squiggles and dots were not uniformly spaced. However, they were spaced directly in front of the Sagan Mini and clustered together into a familiar circular shape. Earth. Thousands, or millions, it's hard to tell, of these tiny shapes were clustered together to form a nearly photorealistic grayscale version of Earth nearly 10 feet across. It then rippled again and showed a similar planet. Somnus. More rippling, constant this time, and the image of the obelisk of Somnus zoomed out past the other planets and sun to include Earth on the other side of their shared orbit. From here, the view zoomed into Earth through clouds and squiggles and past the mountains of the scene. The view changed to the outline of a human man and woman standing together. These shapes were oriented in such a way as to make the humans appear shaded, as they were slightly three-dimensional. Another ripple. The human man and woman appeared again. They were shaded this time and appeared to be arguing. Another ripple. The man had the woman by the throat and appeared to be strangling her as she sagged, unconscious. The man was still holding the woman, but was now surrounded by 3 other men, holding what appeared to be guns. Another ripple. The 3 men celebrated their victory over the dead bodies, both limp and one having multiple holes in his head. The view zoomed out, away from the 3 men to show a city on fire. Hundreds of small human-like shapes were running away from the central fires, as others appeared to be attacking them and stealing from abandoned buildings. The view zoomed out even further, showing a countryside full of dead trees and starving animals looking on at a city on fire behind them. Another ripple, slower this time, more deliberate. This time, the obelisk showed Earth again. This time, wreathed in flames, war and death. Among the chaos that was the Earth, there was a small rocket ship leaving. The rocket ship appeared to be on fire. Another ripple. The flaming rocket ship was shown in the foreground approaching Somnus. Through the window of the ship, men and women could be seen all holding guns and celebrating. The ship was shown on the surface of Somnus, doors open and fire coming from every opening. Behind the rocket, the men and women were shooting their guns at the flaming lily pad trees and tearing the smoking lichen from the ground. Over the rocket, there was a gigantic human hand in the sky, casting its massive shadow on the scene below. The hand had come down, crushing the rocket, men and women extinguishing the fire. The view now showed the Earth, still on fire and chaos, clenched in the same hand and being squeezed like a stress ball. Next to the hand holding the Earth, another hand was blocking all of the flaming rockets as they had attempted to flee. It was at this point that the real commotion in the control room began. Through the entire obelisk encounter, the NASA members sat motionless. But now, they were yelling and pointing at something off-screen. Some appeared to be frozen, but the others were all but jumping in excitement or fear at the mystery off-screen. With a sickening lurch, the Sagan Five moved. Nothing was visible from the forward-facing camera, but the probe was definitely being moved by something down the hill, towards the lake. The Sagan mini-probe's camera feed was switched to the defective camera 4. Not much was visible of the entity, since the camera was pointing at the ground. But there was a disturbance in the lichen. Whereas before it was soft and light green, now it appeared to vibrate in ripples outward from underneath the probe in greenish-white rings. The feet of the probe hovered nearly a foot in the air as the probe was being carried slowly out of the forest. With a green-gray blur, the feed from the broken camera was cut off and changed to static. The movement in the front-facing camera did not change. Sagan Mini's view came back onto the bottom screen. The obelisk was a giant mass of rippling. It appeared as if there were millions of insects trapped within the surface that were trying to pierce their way through the outer shell. With a speed I would not have thought possible, the obelisk shrank in height and expanded along its base, enveloping the small exploration probe. The bottom screen once again cut to static. Only the front-facing camera remained in working order. Along with the NASA teams, I watched as the probe turned and was carried up the gentle slope towards the outcropping where the obelisk used to stand. Instead of an obelisk on the outcropping, there now stood a gray, pulsating hand. It was angrily pulsating, sending ripples upward from under the ground. As the probe continued to be carried up the hill, the ground around the giant hand began to crack and split as more of the hand exploded out from the ground, sending rocks flying. Rocks, large and small, that flew towards the helpless probe were swatted aside by some dark blur from behind the camera. Despite dispatching dozens of rocks, whatever carried the Sagan Five did not appear to falter in the slightest. The probe's progress continued up the slight grade, seemingly undeterred by the commotion. Finally, the trip came to an end. Sagan Five was set down abruptly, and the dark blur zoomed around the probe on all sides towards the giant waiting hand and arm. Like a drop of water entering a puddle, the blur combined with the giant arm. Then slowly, but gaining speed as it went, the giant hand began to fall towards the probe. Faster and faster it fell, closing the hundreds of feet in just over a second. At the final moment before it impacted, all of the millions of tiny squiggles and dots across the surface of the giant arm flashed a brilliant green, and the final video transmission from Sagan Five cut to black. On the black screen, hundreds of tiny green dots and squiggles darted chaotically around like static. They began to collect into larger groups that continued to bounce around the screen. Eventually, a pattern began to emerge as grouping of squiggles and dots began to collect in rows horizontally across the video feed on the large screen. Letters in nearly every major language spoken on Earth filled the screen, all reading out the same message. In German, French, Arabic, Chinese, Korean, Spanish, Italian, English, and several others that I didn't recognize. The letters read, "We have watched you for many hundreds of generations, and you have not changed. Your madness will either end you, or it will cleanse you. Even you keep your insane locked away from normal society." This display lasted for several minutes. Suddenly, with a bright blue-white flash, a dark sphere opened up in front of the video displays. Papers, people, and everything remotely close to the center of the room went carrying outwards away from the sphere. As quickly as the sphere appeared, it collapsed back into itself, sucking all the loose papers, people, and objects back towards that same point. Through the now very crooked display from the knocked-over camera, it was just possible to make out the Sagan Five probe, sitting in the center of the room, exactly where the sphere appeared. It is here that the film roll ends. I haven't told anybody else about finding this. I'm afraid that if this gets too big, it might come back to get me. I've never heard of any space probes called Sagan, and I wasn't able to find any on Google. Someone has covered every part of this up. Someone with a lot of power. I have family, and I don't want them getting dragged into this. I feel like the community here has just the right amount of disbelief and willingness to listen. If anyone seems to take this seriously, and nothing happens to me, I plan on slowly leaking this, a bit at a time. I don't want to disappear, but this is too big to keep hidden from the world. I think we have a right to know. I'm going to keep sharing stories here for a couple reasons. I enjoy it, and it is a subtle way for you all to know that I'm still alive. If you don't hear any more from me after this, thanks for hearing my story. And you can assume what happened. It's been a pleasure